My name is Amanda, and welcome to Mountain Movers' first episode. This episode is called I'm Not Special. I'm going to give you some background about myself and the origin of Mountain Movers, and how this dream is becoming a reality. I do just want to give a disclaimer that I do talk about suicide and depression in this episode. If you're struggling with mental health, I encourage you to get professional help. Nothing you find online or in podcasts is going to replace the professional help that is required to overcome those obstacles. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've sat down to make this episode a dozen times and I can't get through it because talking about yourself and then talking about the not so glorious parts of yourself is very difficult. But I realized that in order for you to understand my passion behind Mountain Movers, I really need to explain where it came from. So let's get into it. My mom and I immigrated to the United States in 1996 from war-torn Bosnia, and that is a Mountain Mover story in itself, but I'll save it for another day. I'm just telling you that to set the tone. We came here with very little to no money, speaking only a few words of English, and having really very little resources, no family, nothing like that. So kudos to my mom. She's a Mountain Mover story for sure. She came here to give us a better life, and at first it didn't seem like it was a better life, but as the story unfolds, you'll realize just how great that decision was. So I grew up very poor. While most children were getting into t-ball and ballet, I was walking around the streets looking for returnable cans so we can eat and make ends meet. My mom was ill, so, she had many restless nights as a child. I'd hear her cry and comfort her, and it was very difficult. Because we were poor, I had to start working at a very young age. I started working when I was 14 to help pay bills and debt. And we moved a dozen times because we lived in Section 8 housing. So we lived in some really rough parts of the neighborhood. Landlords turned properties for profit very quickly. So I feel like we never stayed in an apartment for very long. Just felt like there was a lot of instability. So because I had to mature very quickly, because that is what life required of me, I think I was a little socially awkward. I had a very difficult time making friends. I had very little in common with my peers. They go on vacations and Disney and they talk about this and they talk about that. And, I didn't have much to share. Like I knew about credit card debt at such a very young age. So I had a hard time making friends. When I was old enough to start dating, that became difficult. I didn't have a good male figure in my life or a relationship to idolize or look up to. My dad wasn't a part of my life due to his own issues. But that was also something else that weighed heavily on me, is why my father wasn't a part of my life. What was wrong with me? Why didn't he want to know me? As a child, you think about those things, and all of these things as a kid started to snowball and really affect me in my early adulthood. I became very depressed. I was unmotivated. I was good at school when I applied myself, but I was started to become uninterested in school. I was working as a waitress while going to school, barely making ends meet still, and I slowly became very, very depressed over all of this. And I went through my depression alone, which I do not recommend doing that. I went through my depression alone because I felt like people wouldn't understand, or they wouldn't listen, or they would judge me. And now, being where I am, I realize that's not the truth. There are so many kind people in this world, more than we realize. People are willing to listen, but they don't know unless you reach out. So please, if you are struggling with any mental illness, please, please, please find someone to talk to, because doing it alone is not easy. So just to backtrack, I became very depressed in my early adulthood. I would go to bed and I would pray not to wake up. I felt like life had nothing for me. I had no purpose. I was stuck in a curse, and this was as good as it was going to get. I was going to continue to work hard and barely pay my bills, and I wasn't going to find someone to love me because I was so screwed up. And I had nothing to look forward to. You know, wishing not to wake up eventually turned into multiple suicide attempts until one night everything changed. I couldn't do it anymore, really. I was just so hurt. Everything was so heavy. And I tried to overdose, and I was laying on the bathroom floor, and all of a sudden it was calm. And it was quiet in my body. And I was content. And knowing that there was an out felt so peaceful. But only for a split second. Then all of a sudden, something changed like a switch and panic set in. And I realized, hold on, maybe this isn't what I want. Maybe this isn't all life has to offer me. I can't find love. Well, who's to say that I won't? And I don't have money right now, but who's to say that I can't work really hard and get it? And I don't have friends, but who's to say I can't make any? And as these thoughts were going through my head, I realized that I had messed up and that I wanted another chance to live life to its fullest potential. So I grabbed my phone, I called my best friend. So thankful that he answered. Him and my mom took me to the emergency room. And what I didn't realize is that when you go to the emergency room as a suicide attempt, you have to stay for evaluation, and rightfully so. Absolutely, you should stay for evaluation. But at the time, I didn't want to. I kicked and screamed and I threw a tantrum, and I didn't want to go to the psych ward for multiple reasons. I was going to have this label now, right? Mental health comes with a stigma and a label. And I was embarrassed, and I didn't want to get lost in this cycle of mental health, so I didn't want to go. And I wasn't there very long before it got worse, this panic. I was like, I don't belong here. There's a gentleman running around screaming his body's on fire, and it's loud and chaotic, and there's multiple people there with so many different issues. I was like, I'm not like these people. Until I realized that I am. People aren't different. They're all hurt. And the gentleman who was running around screaming that his body was on fire, we started to form a friendship, and he said, Amanda, do you think maybe that you're not depressed and maybe you're just hurt? And, you know, I was totally depressed for sure, but I was so hurt. I was so hurt in many ways. I didn't have a father who wanted to be a part of my life. I didn't fit in with my peers. I had no friends. I worked hard but still didn't get to get my nails done and go do things, and was racking up an enormous amount of credit card debt in my early 20s. I just felt so alone. I had nothing going for me. So yeah, I was hurt, and I was carrying a lot that I didn't understand. And I left the psych ward with a tiny flicker of light inside me. And that flicker over the next few years started to grow brighter and brighter and brighter as I realized that I had the power to change the trajectory of my life. And that felt good and powerful, and I felt like I had a purpose. My purpose was to better myself so I can live a meaningful life and bring love and positivity to the people around me. And everything started to change. I started to take school more seriously. I graduated with a bachelor's and a doctorate in chiropractic. You know, and chiropractic doesn't, you know, you don't graduate as a chiropractor and get handed this job and glorious salary like medical doctors. It is a grind for chiropractors. Most chiropractors end up doing something else because that's how difficult it is. So this isn't a story of how education necessarily changed my life. It did, but it's a story of how perseverance and determination and grit can change your life. I graduated school and I used my past struggles and my fears to fuel me. I knew where I had come from, this depressed, lonely state. And I was so scared to go back. So much so that it just fueled me and pushed me to continue moving myself forward personally and professionally. Because I didn't want to be the girl on the bathroom floor ever again. I didn't want to know that hurt and that pain ever again. So I worked really, really hard. I went from moving over a dozen times through Section 8 housing to owning 3 properties. One in which I've moved my mother into so she no longer has to worry about moving. One in which me and my husband live in, and a commercial property. That's just honestly unbelievable when I think about it. I went from not having any good relationships to finding my husband who met me at almost the lowest point of my life, but chose to love me and go through that struggle with me. And I found a relationship and a love that I never thought that I was worthy of. But you know what had happened? As I was changing myself and getting an education and becoming more confident and realizing my worth, I attracted this amazing individual who also saw my potential and my worth. And I have a wonderful marriage that I never thought I was going to have. I thought I had a family curse maybe of not being able to find true love. And I convinced myself of this, and I think that's why I always led myself to these toxic relationships, just to fill a void and to be a placeholder for the time being. I own one of the busiest chiropractic offices in my area. I've learned about debt, good and bad debt. I have financial stability. I live a life I never, ever in a million years thought was imaginable. But I work hard every single day. And all this to say that I am not special. I didn't come from money or a known family or have an array of mentors. I didn't have anything but myself and my experience of hurt. All I had was pain. And I let that pain drive me into the direction of where I wanted to go. I'm not special. You can do this. If you have a story of pain and hurt and struggle and obstacles, I want you to think about it as your advantage. You have this motivation to get out of this dark place or this place you don't want to be in. And this goes for anything. It goes for if you want to lose weight and just get healthier, or you want to have stronger financial independence. This can be applied to anything. Whatever mountain is standing in front of you, you have the power to move it. But I'll be honest, it takes work and it's not easy. And you're going to work hard day in and day out and day in and day out and feel like nothing is changing until one day everything has changed. I believe in you. Let's get moving.